Welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm here today at Mastermind Studios, and I'm your host, Kirsten Pfeiffer. I am so excited because today I'm joined by the host of one of my favorite podcasts, Kat Harris. Kat hosts The Refined Collective, which is a podcast designed to dig deep and go below the surface. She really holds space for such nuanced conversations, and honestly, whenever I listen to them, I'm always really challenged by them, and I'm always learning. So I'm really excited for Kat to be here with us today. She is an online educator, a speaker, a photographer, and now author. Her new book, Sexless in the City, is coming out this week. So I am so excited. We're going to talk all about that and really dive in. Kat is originally from Texas, loves ranch and Beyonce, which as soon as I heard you say that, I was like, okay, she gets it. But yeah, she really believes in the power of story and that every opportunity is an opportunity for growth if we choose it to be. I'm so excited for you guys to hear her heart and her wisdom. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kat.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just so excited to connect with you and get to just take the online friendship to now a Zoom and podcast friendship. we're just taking those friendship milestones to the next level.
Yes, exactly. I was just telling Mark, who helps me with the podcast. I was like, I feel like I'm about to go on to a blind date of someone that I met on Instagram.
100%. When people ask me what is podcasting like, I say it's like going on a blind date on a phone call.
Yeah.
Or sometimes there's Zoom, and then not only is it like a blind date, but you're trying to really get to the heart of sometimes really tough topics or vulnerability. And it definitely has made me a better dater.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I definitely, especially in the days of online dating now, and I feel like it's a skill set that translates across both things.
Yeah.
So
It's always a good skill to be able to learn how to be curious about another person and be able to draw out their story and connect.
right.
So I'm here for it.
Yeah. Well, let's just get started can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? I know a little bit about your story and how you came to be a fashion photographer in New York and went on this really beautiful journey of starting now the Refined Collective and now Sexless in the City. So I would love if you could just tell readers a little bit about who you are and where you got to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So nothing about what I do or my career path has been linear by any means. I grew up in Southern conservative Christian culture, which is a whole other kind of weird sort of world. I was actually a Bible major in college and then transitioned into the nonprofit world for several years, traveled all over the United States doing advocacy, traveled overseas for my job in the nonprofit world, and then kind of stumbled into the photography realm. I worked for one of the top photographers in the nation for about 4 years, and I had zero experience when he hired me. Literally did not know how to turn on a camera. And then 4 years into working for him, I find myself starting my own business, shooting editorial, fashion week, runway, lifestyle, and then transitioned to living in New York City. Along that time, I also started the blog The Refined Woman. And it used to be one of my girlfriends and I, when we started it, it was first a style blog. So if you want to see some really awkward and painful style posts, go back and see my old style post. I was broke like you wouldn't know it. It wasn't my thing. And I think like a lot of experiences we have in life, we don't know what we don't want to do until we actually try it.
Right.
And The Refined Woman really has transitioned so much over the last 9 years to now primarily being a space where I share my life. I kind of remove the shiny mask of perfection of having it all together because no one does.
Yeah.
And talk about life. I talk a lot about sexuality and spirituality. I do a lot of relationship coaching to single women, a lot of single women of faith who have approached dating with a lot of shame, have approached their body with a lot of shame. So my heart is really to empower women to walk out their lives with freedom and wholeness, and to have the tools to identify limiting beliefs and fear and shame narratives that are really holding them back in their lives.
Mm.
And also in that, I am super passionate about teaching and equipping people to develop a healthy sexual ethic, so
Mm.
that then in their dating lives and their relationships, they can show up with autonomy and agency, and knowing, why am I showing up the way I'm showing up? Why do I believe what I believe about my
Yeah.
body, about sex, about intimacy? And then once we know our why, we can figure out how we want to practically walk that season out. So the Refined Collective, my podcast, was just another leg of the blog that started a few years ago. And yeah, my first book, Sexless in the City, comes out in April, which I am super excited about. And that is the story of my journey of moving to New York City, never really having questioned the sexual scripts that I was given growing up in conservative Christian culture. And then getting to a place in New York where I dated a lot, got heartbroken, and really was at a fork in the road where I just did not know what I believed about
Mm.
God or sex or anything really outside of what
Mm.
I had been told. So I went on a journey of asking some really hard questions. What does the
Yeah.
Bible really say about sexuality, gender roles, me, my body? Do I care what it has to say?
Mm.
And really, it led me on a path of greater discovery than I could have ever imagined. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what the book is about, is my journey of asking the questions and looking at questions from a more three-dimensional perspective, as opposed to 1D, this is what it is, and
Yeah.
curious about it.
I love all that so much. And I think it's so important today more than ever. We live in such a polarized world and like an echo chamber of our own beliefs that sometimes we don't even know why it is what we believe, why we believe that. And I love that you're holding space for those conversations and really empowering people to uncover their beliefs in a way that you did. And I think what you said about, really gaining an understanding of our sexual ethic and why we believe what we believe. I think no matter where you stand on the spectrum of faith, like I'm a believer, I know you are as well, but anyone listening to this, you don't have to believe that to be part of this conversation. We all have been given some kind of narrative along the way that has led us to believe what we believe. So, I want you to kind of maybe set the stage of what this purity culture is in the church that you talk about a lot in your book, because I think that's one end of the spectrum for some people. And then another end of the spectrum is this hookup culture that we live in, and all the images of sex and sexualization and showing our bodies that we've seen from a young age in the media. And so it really leads us to be in this confusing place of like, what do I believe and who do I listen to? And then when no one's talking about it, I feel like in church a lot, people don't really have transparent conversations. And so it leads to a place where you feel like you can't talk to anyone. And in that space, I think is where shame sometimes comes from. So for anyone that might not be familiar with what we're referring to when we refer to purity culture, can you explain a little bit about what that is, as well as how it has influenced a generation of women in the church and beyond?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm happy to share my perspective on that. So the purity culture, as I experienced it was really at its height in the 90s and early 2000s, and it kind of ran on the heels of books like I Kiss Dating Goodbye and True Love Waits. And really what it was an evangelical agenda to control a generation of people to not have sex until marriage.
Mm.
Now, I don't know that the purity movement started out as something with the heart of it to oppress a generation of people or offer shame-induced narratives, but really what it did was it gave a set of rules, to a set of often shame-based rules and
Mm.
shame-based metaphors about our bodies, about sex outside of marriage, and gave these rules in such a way that if you don't follow them, if you don't conform, you don't have a seat at the table.
Mm.
And so I think what happened is we experienced a generation millions and millions of young people who became terrified of their sexual desire,
Mm.
terrified of any sort of conversation about sex. So sex was already an awkward conversation. It already felt taboo. And then add on top of it that, oh my gosh, my sexual desire is sinful. Oh
Mm.
my gosh, if I have sex outside of marriage, I am like a dirty rose or a used piece of gum, and no
Mm.
one wants a used piece of gum, or
Yeah.
like two pieces of Velcro that have been pulled apart too many times. So by the time you meet your spouse, there's no more stickiness left. And so I think what is so hard about that is it teaches rules without heart and rules without vision. And from what I know about God, and I obviously do not know everything, is that it seems as though God really cares about our heart and
Mm-hmm.
not behavior modification.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the most damaging things about the purity movement is I think we always have to ask the question in any conversation, who's benefiting from these narratives and who is suffering from these narratives. And it seems as though the people who suffer most from the purity culture narratives are women.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have suffered the most because we were told that we are not sexual in the way that boys are. We
Mm.
were told that it's our job as women to protect the male gaze. So cover your body, wear fingertip length shorts, don't wear two-piece, don't wear a bikini, because underneath that message is boys will be boys,
Mm.
which is one of my favorite authors, Peggy Orenstein. She's a writer for the New York Times. She says that is just one short step from boys will be boys to she was asking for it.
Mm. Yeah.
So we created a generation of women who not only were required to uphold their own quote unquote sexual purity, it also became our job to uphold the sexual purity of the entire male population.
Mm.
And so I think that has encouraged silence. I think that has dismissed consent. I think it has encouraged rape culture.
Yeah.
And I think it has so many problems for women, and then it
Mhm.
also I think has a really low view of men.
Mm.
Will boys just be boys? Are men just the sum of their urges? Is it my job as a woman to take responsibility over someone else's sexual encounters, over
Right.
their lack of discipline? I'm just not buying it. So that is a little bit of the purity culture and the narratives that I received and internalized from growing up in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for laying that out. And I think everything you said is so true. And especially that idea of like God is so much more concerned about our heart than any kind of
Mhm.
behavior modification. And I think no matter what it is that we're talking about, if you try to approach anything in life by like, let me just put a band-aid on it and fix the external thing without really looking at the root of it, it's always
Yeah.
going to grow back. And so I love that you laid that out with so much clarity. And I think having that clarity and that transparency is what creates the space to clear shame. I think that shame is so prevalent no matter whether we're talking about sex or even eating too much or whatever. It's one of those things that tries to attack us in so many different ways. And I personally am such a fan of Brene Brown. I don't know if you're familiar
Yeah.
with her work.
Who isn't?
Yeah, right. But she's a shame researcher, as you know. And so she makes the distinction that shame is I am bad, whereas
Mhm.
something like guilt is I did something bad. And obviously
Right.
I am bad is a lot harder to rectify because that's your identity, right? And so where do you think this shame comes from? Do you think it's from the church, or in your experience, why do so many people experience so much shame today?
I think it's part of being human.
Mm.
I think deep down, every human wants and longs for the same things. We all want to
Mhm.
be loved. We all want to be accepted. We all want to feel known. We
Mm.
all want to essentially be naked and unashamed. We want to be accepted, of course, for our gifts and what we bring to the table, but
Mhm.
maybe even more so, we want to be accepted
Mm.
for our cellulite,
Yeah.
for our baggage, in spite of the pain and trauma of our past that we bring to the table. And
Mm,
so I think we're constantly all walking around, am I enough? Am I too
right.
much? And so when we're coming from a place of fear, do I have a seat at the table? Then shame just sneaks right in there, because the agenda of shame is to keep us small, stuck, hidden, and isolated.
Yeah.
And so I think it doesn't matter if you grew up in faith circles or not. I think faith circles and culture equally have shame agendas. The cultural narrative is often, do what feels good, instant gratification. You want what you want when you want it, and you deserve to have it whenever you want to have it.
Mm,
So if you're not chasing pleasure, if you're not chasing your desire, then there's shame there. And that's the gridlock of shame, is that, oh my gosh, if we're talking about sex, it's either, oh my gosh, I'm ashamed in this crowd for having too much sex, but in the other crowd, I'm shamed for not having enough sex. And in the middle ground, I'm shamed for not being one or the other.
yeah.
I think regardless of who you are, you have most likely experienced shame. So I don't know where it comes from, but what I do know is that we all experience it. And
Yeah.
I think it probably comes down to belonging,
Mm,
and we all want to have a sense of belonging. And so when we feel as though in whatever crowd we're participating with, we have not lived up to the expectation of groupthink, whether it's don't have sex until marriage, or if you're not in the neck deep in hookup culture, or
mm,
if you're not chasing the career ladder, or if you believe in vaccinations or not, whatever it is, whatever group you're trying to find belonging in,
yeah.
if you find yourself not playing by their rules and kicked out of the tribe, then what does that give you? Isolation, feelings of being small, feelings of not being enough or too much. And that is where shame crouches. Shame crouches at the door of belonging.
Wow, that's so powerful. Shame crouches at the door of belonging. I
Mm,
think it's so true. And for me, I feel like anytime I've felt shame is feeling like I'm alone in that, and what you said about, the world says one thing and culture says this thing and politics say another thing. And we are just so in our echo chambers that you think you have to believe everything that everyone in your group believes, and otherwise you will be alone. And like you said, shame leads to isolation. And so I think you have a really healthy perspective on feminism, especially because there's like a narrative of in the church, I think that you've talked about before, and you kind of just mentioned about like wanting to stay small and these
mm.
narratives that try to keep people small, whether it's in the church or not. And then culture has such a different extreme. And I feel like in my personal journey, I've felt really alone in how to navigate those two extremes. I don't think that there's, at least in some of the environments I've been, there is no middle ground, or there's not even a space where we can have conversations for that middle ground. How have you navigated those extremes between what culture says, what the church says, whether that be about your sexuality or even just your feminism?
I think it starts with a posture of being curious.
Mm,
And that's where a lot of people talk about deconstruction comes
mm,
in. Deconstruction is being curious about, how did I get here?
mm,
And what I've also found is truth often lies in between the two extremes. You talk to two people that have had an argument, and one person, oh my gosh, they said this, and this person, oh, they said this. Typically, truth is somewhere in the middle between their two extreme experiences. And so, in that, okay, if we have these massive extremes in culture, whether it's political extremes or religious extremes or what personal belief extremes, I just have always found that truth is outside of the black and white and somewhere in the gray. And so it's somewhere in between. And one thing years ago, a leader in my life told me, as he said, often life is like a pendulum swing.
mm,
We go from one side of the pendulum to the other. And the sweet spot is those few seconds where we're in the middle. between the extremes.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to find balance between extremes, we first have to look inward and ask myself again, deconstruct, how did I get here? And
Mm,
really identify, what is it that I believe? What is it that I believe about myself, about God, about others, about the world, about nature, about my body, about my sexuality, about my beliefs?
mm.
And where did those beliefs come from?
Right. Right.
What did I learn about, since we keep talking about sex,
Yeah.
what did I learn about sex from home? What
Yeah.
did I learn about sex from school, from religious institutions, from my friend group,
Mhm.
from culture at large, from popular culture? And how did those scripts from those different spaces help form into what I believe today? And then from there, what are those beliefs rooted in?
Mm,
Are those beliefs rooted in fear? Are they rooted in control? What's underneath control? Typically, when we want to control a situation or another person, it's because we're afraid, right? So
mm.
again, fear is at the so much as that is the bottom level, the foundation of a lot of the beliefs that we adhere to. And when I discovered that so much of what I believed about the world around me, myself, others, God, was rooted in fear, scarcity, lack, not enough, that's when I got really curious, because it seemed like no matter what side of the extreme, right, there were these narratives that were rooted in fear. So for me, I thought, man, what would it be to be connected to hope, to be
Mm.
connected to possibility, to be connected to abundance,
Right.
love? So from there, I think that is charting the path towards the middle ground, is what is it to be connected to love, hope, possibility, abundance? And am I willing to be rejected by either side?
Mm. Yeah.
Because as soon as I stop playing the game on either side, I'm going to ruffle feathers. I'm going to piss people off. And I think what I realized for most of my life is I was constantly trying to please everyone. And so in pleasing everyone, I was abandoning myself. I was refusing to give myself the permission to ask the questions about reality and spirituality and sexuality, because I was afraid if I even was honest that I was thinking them, that I would be rejected. When actually, when we allow ourselves the permission to acknowledge our desire and to acknowledge our questions and doubts, that is the first step towards breakthrough. That's the first step towards transformation, is when we give ourselves that permission. And so walking the line between the extremes starts with getting curious, looking forward. How did I get here? What are these beliefs rooted in? Fear or freedom? What would it look like if I started walking in freedom? And how would my life day to day change if before I even set my feet on the ground, I believed I was enough?
Wow.
I believed that regardless of what anyone else thinks or says, that I have a seat at the table. I belong here. So if I know that I have a sense of belonging, then I can chart my own path.
Yeah.
Then I can see the extremes and maybe find a more nuanced, layered experience of life.
Wow. It's so much of what you said honestly resonates with me and my journey. There's a reason why the name of this podcast is Imperfect, because
Mhm.
my whole life I struggled with this sense of perfectionism, as I think many of us do. And what that perfectionism then translated to was me wanting to please everyone,
Mm.
me not wanting to say the wrong thing at fear of maybe offending someone. And like you said, in that space of fear, it's actually robbing ourselves of becoming who we actually are, and then also robbing the people around us of seeing who that is, because we're created very specifically for a very specific reason, and we have the gifts and the thoughts and the passions that we do for a reason. And so if we dim that in any way to try to please the people around us, we're actually robbing them the opportunity of all experiencing each other, of how we were really authentically made. What was your journey like of getting to that place of being curious and really asking why you believe what you believe? I know I was listening to Anthony O'Neill's podcast when he had you on, and you had this quote that I loved. You said, "It's easy not to have sex when you live in a culture that shames sex outside of marriage. It's easy to have certain political beliefs when everyone believes a certain thing. It's easy to have thoughts about the LGBTQ community when you have no one in your life who identifies as that, and that it's so important to put ourselves in hard circumstances." And so you kind of explained a little bit about how you did that, but what was your journey like of putting yourself in those hard circumstances? When did you start to do that? And how can someone listening really start to go on this journey of deconstructing why they believe what they believe and really getting to who they authentically are?
Yeah. So as far as the journey of me kind of going on putting myself in hard circumstances is honestly right after college, I moved to Southern California and worked for a nonprofit and lived in a house with 50 people.
Wow.
And there were people that believed what I believed about life and God and shared a worldview. And there were people who didn't believe that at all. It was every shade of person, every shade of belief, every shade of life experience. And that opened my eyes so much to, oh my gosh, life is so much bigger than my experience at a small Christian Texas Baptist Bible school.
Yeah.
And then from there, I traveled all over the United States, living out of a van with a couple people doing advocacy work. And again, meeting every sort of shade of person, believer of God, not believer in God, universalist, agnostic, LDS, atheist, and seeing, wow, all people, we all want the same thing.
Mm,
And man, it's really easy to have really firm beliefs about whatever you want to talk about, politics, um, God, sexuality, when you are only surrounded by people who speak your language.
mm,
And so after my experience of meeting all sorts of people all over the US and world through my job, I realized, man, I never want to be in an echo chamber.
mm,
I never want to just surround myself with people who look like I do, talk like I do, know my jargon, know and believe what I believe about God and life and everything else. I
mm.
want to constantly be challenged.
Yeah.
And if I'm not being challenged, then I'm not growing. And if
Mm,
I am not stepping outside of my comfort zone, I will never grow because growth begins the moment we choose to leave what we know, to leave the comfort zone. So for me,
yeah.
it was about putting myself in situations and circumstances where there were people very different than me. It
Mm,
was being vulnerable and allowing myself to be known and allowing myself to know others that believed other than I
mm,
believe. And it's been such a beautiful journey. My closest friends in the world don't believe what I believe about
yeah.
God, life, sex.
Yeah.
And I am so grateful. I am constantly a student to their life experiences and what has given them hope and brought them truth. And in fact, I think the greatest lie that I believed for a long time that kept me from growth was that only a person that believes what I believe about God can share truth with me.
Wow.
Wow, what an arrogant thought. What an arrogant thought that the owner of truth is someone who only believes exactly what I believe about my spirituality.
Yeah.
Wow. So then what do we do with the amazing social justice organizations that aren't rooted in any faith conversation? What do we do with people who are kind? Why do we think we quote unquote as Christians have ownership over goodness? And if we look
Mm,
at the church in America, we've done a terrible job at being an expression of hope, goodness, restoration. And
yeah.
so I think it's really a refusal to surround ourselves with people who think, believe, talk like us. And that's when we grow is getting out there, get curious, put yourself in situations where you're around people different than you. I am
Mm-hmm.
very hesitant towards a person who is only around people that think like them
Yeah.
and only around people that believes like them. I'm like, no, I don't trust you. You're not
Yeah.
committed to your growth.
That I feel like that all comes back to what we were talking about before about fear. That wanting to be like, oh, I can only engage with you or I will only support your organization X, Y, or Z, whatever the thing is, if you believe exactly what I believe. Again, that's coming from fear of like, oh, I actually might be wrong. I personally love having conversations with my friends that, whether it's like I'm Christian, they're not, and like they ask me really hard questions. I love that because it's like, why do I believe what I believe? If we're not forced to question our beliefs, then we actually are not sharpening ourselves. We don't have a full understanding of why we believe what we believe. And like you said, I love that you brought up that it really takes vulnerability to surround ourselves with people that don't believe what we believe and to constantly be learning. I think vulnerability is really scary, but it also is what empowers us to be connected and to really
Yeah,
foster that. So I love everything you
absolutely.
said.
Yeah, and it takes a posture of humility.
Mm, yeah,
I'm wrong a lot. I'm wrong every single day. What if I'm wrong about what I believe about anything?
right.
What would it look like for me to show up in every area of my life with a posture of humility and curiosity? That doesn't mean that I am abandoning my truth. It just means that I'm acknowledging that I, Kat Harris, am a 35-year-old human. I have not been alive for millions of years. I have a very specific experience. I am a white woman, heterosexual, cisgender,
Yeah.
that grew up in upper white middle class. So I
Hmm.
have experienced immense privilege because of all of those things. Is it possible that someone else could have had just as truthful of an experience and it be completely different than mine?
Yeah.
I think if we're not able to see that that is possible,
Hmm.
then I don't know that anything will ever change.
Absolutely. And I think it's like so easy nowadays. It's like we just want to jump at people that don't say exactly the right thing. And again, that leads to fear, that leads to isolation. I don't know. Did you see The Social Dilemma, the documentary on
Mhm.
Netflix? And it's
Yeah.
like we all, think that what we believe is the truth and it's like and black and white, this is it. I was so blown away when I saw that like if you Google something in one part of the country it shows up as something different. So again, it's like pushing us further and further away, and I think less people are willing to be vulnerable, to be humble, to be challenged in what they believe. And so I love again that you are creating those conversations and really being a role model of what it looks like to walk that out and to really deconstruct why you
Yeah.
believe what you believe. And we haven't really talked
Yeah.
as much about singleness yet, which I love. I mean, I'm single. I feel like I've been single most of my life. I'm always like the single friend in my friend group. And, I think there's this pressure sometimes to be like, why aren't you in a relationship? And again, it puts this shame or this like false narrative that, you're not whole until you are in a relationship or a marriage. And so I would love if you could just talk about how you've pursued wholeness pre-relationship and why is that so important?
Well, I believe that, first of all, relationship status doesn't give or take away any sort of my identity or worth. So the starting point is I am whole, I am enough, period, the end. I
Yeah.
have dignity, value, worth, calling, purpose pulsing through my being because I breathe.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with anything external. It has nothing to do with whether or not I have a diamond ring on my finger. And so I think starting the conversation there and holding the tension of if this is what feels authentic to you. And I also want to be in a relationship.
Yeah.
I can want both things. I can be at peace and loving the experience that I am in, and I can also want something else. It's
Yeah.
not an all or nothing conversation or
Mhm.
either or, it's a both and.
Yeah.
And I think that if we don't heal our past, it haunts us.
Mm.
And if we don't heal our past, we recreate the trauma of our past over and over and over and over again until we heal those patterns. It's why children of addicts either become addicts themselves or date and marry addicts.
Mm,
It's why if you believe this narrative, I'm always the friend, I'm always the friend, I'm always the friend, well, then guess what?
mm,
If it because I'm so committed to that experience and that narrative because of whatever happened to me when I was 13 years old that set me down that trajectory of believing guys don't like me, guys like my friends, then everything that does or doesn't happen becomes evidence for that narrative.
mm,
So I don't think seeking wholeness has anything to do with whether or not you're in a relationship. I say seek wholeness like your life depends on it because maybe it does, and
yeah,
seek wholeness regardless if you're in a relationship. If you are single, seek wholeness, go to
yeah,
therapy, go to a 12-step program, move through the patterns of your past. And when you're in a relationship, guess what? That person becomes a mirror for you if it's a healthy relationship. And
right.
more stuff is going to dig up. The human condition is that we always have opportunities to grow until our last breath.
Mm,
So for me, it's really regardless of single or dating or married or whatever, is how can I show up with a growth mindset? How can
mm,
I always be curious about, hmm, I wonder what came up for me in that interaction
yeah.
with the bank when they called me. Why did I get so huffy and puffy? Oh, I felt really scared that I wasn't going to have enough money or whatever it is. I think just to have a growth mindset, regardless of the season that you're in. And then I would say, that we are a very determined and intentional culture when it comes to things like physical fitness, when it
Mm,
comes to things like our careers. I mean, I don't know about you, but for my career, I left Texas, I moved cross country, I accepted a job position where I was making $7 a day
mm,
because I believed in the mission.
mhm.
And then from there, I worked for another nonprofit where I made less than $25,000 a year. And then I worked for a photographer where I made $12 an hour. And then I moved cross country to New York City to start my own business
Mm,
and put in hours and hours and hours of work and was willing to do anything and everything to quote unquote build my business and build my brand. Yet with dating, we say stuff like, oh, it'll just happen when it happens. Or, well, I don't want to play God. If God wants me to have a partner, God will bring that person into my life.
mm.
Really?
Right.
Really? But also, if you want to be a neurosurgeon, you're going to have to do more than pray about it.
Right.
You pray about it. Yeah, pray about your future. Be intentional or pray about your love life, of course. But we are not passive bystanders in our lives. If you want to be the neurosurgeon, guess what? You have to get good grades, you have to apply, get accepted, and then go through the program and then go through the residency. You can't be passive about that. You get to be active about that. So
Yeah.
I wonder what it would be like if we were just as intentional about our love lives
Mm.
as we are about every other area of our lives. Do
Wow.
you want to be in a relationship? What are you doing to take responsibility for your dating life? What are you doing to actively be pursuing,
Mhm.
whether it's wholeness, whether it's romantic encounters, whether it's dating? What are you doing to be just as intentional about this part of your life as you are every other part of your life? And I think we just get weird and woo woo and
Mhm.
passive in our love lives, really because we're ultimately scared of rejection.
Yeah.
So if I don't, if, because here I am, I'm doing the work and I've done the work for a long time and I'm still single.
Yeah.
So I might do the work and still be single. So maybe it's just easier and less of a risk if I don't even try.
Right,
And
right.
if I just use spiritual bypass language and say, "Oh, well, God has that." Okay. Well, if you want to lose 10 pounds, like you can pray about that, or you can actually do something about it.
Yeah. And it's like, why are we not? Like, we have that mindset about everything else, about our careers, about fitness, but we don't have that mindset about dating always. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes there's a narrative of like, oh, he'll complete me, or all these, we lie to ourselves, like, oh, all these things that I'm unhappy about in my life will suddenly be fixed when the person comes into my life. And I heard an analogy once of like a bucket with holes in it. Like, if you put water in it, the water will keep coming up, but until we patch up those holes, it won't be sustainable. And like you said, again, I feel like it always comes back to fear and vulnerability, because it's like, at the end of the day, it does take vulnerability to be so intentional and still be single. I'm the same way. I've been really intentional with my dating life, most of my life, but especially these last few years, I've really been pursuing that wholeness and what it means of like who I am, Kirsten,
Mhm.
and I'm still single. And so that is a vulnerable place to be, but at least I know who I am and no one can take that away from me. So
Mhm.
I love everything you have to say, and just your journey on that. So I also would just love for you to, we talked about your book, Sexless in the City, a little bit, and we've been talking about this purity culture and all of that. But I would love to just dive a little more into that, of what was your journey like to write Sexless in the City? I know it was starting from a place of really wanting to uncover God's heart and really deconstructing, like, what are the things I'm doing out of a shame narrative that I've been believing, and what do I actually believe? So I would just love if you can explain that journey a little more, as well as tell listeners what Sexless in the City is about.
Yeah, so Sexless in the City is my story of growing up in Southern Christian culture and really never questioning the sexual scripts and narratives that I was given about my body, about sex. And then really when I moved to New York City almost a decade ago, dating more in 1 year than I dated in a decade, and falling in love, getting heartbroken, and really coming to a fork in the road experience in my own life of, what do I believe about God? I didn't actually, like you said, oh, you wrote this book about why does God say these things? I didn't know God said those things.
Mm,
I didn't know that the Bible actually said don't have sex until marriage. All I
mm,
knew is that that's what I had been told.
yeah.
So for me, it was a journey of researching every single verse in the Bible that talked about sex and intimacy and relationships. It was me asking anyone and everyone, whether I was at a bar, in the subway, at a yoga class with my friends, and saying, hey, what do you think about sex? What do you think about your body? Where did you get those beliefs from? It
Mm,
was me getting curious about the neurological impacts of things like orgasm. What happens in our body when we are physically intimate with
mm,
another human? Is there anything that science tells us about our bodies? Is there
mm,
anything that psychiatrists tells us about our bodies, or journalist or anthropologist? And so, I mean, I read dozens of books, everything from Jewish feminists to New York Times journalists to really anyone and everyone in between, just to kind of figure out, man, what do I believe? What do I believe about God? What do I believe about sex? And how can I identify and dismantle the scripts I was given that are no longer serving me? And
mm,
then how can I reconstruct a healthy sexual ethic that feels authentic to who I am and also still stays in alignment with my values and my faith? And
mm,
then only after that can I answer questions like, so what do I want? How do I want to date? How can I show up with agency and autonomy in any of my romantic encounters? What physical boundaries do I or do I not want to have in dating, and why?
mhm.
So the book is really my journey from deconstruction to reconstruction, and then how do I practically want to live out my life?
Yeah.
So yeah, the hope is that regardless of what you do or do not believe, that hopefully the tools in my story and the journey that I went on could, whether you agree or not with the conclusions I came to, hopefully that they will empower you to go on your own journey of seeking and discovery.
Yeah, I love that so much. I have one more question. I just would love if you could explain how your journey has actually led to more freedom and what you've learned through it all, because I think sometimes there is this fear that if I'm uncovering these things that the Bible says, it's actually going to lead me to this really oppressed lifestyle. I think, again, getting back to religion, wanting to put these narratives of fear on us to control behavior, but that is so not the heart of God. The heart of God is for us to live in freedom. And so I would love if you could just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think I grew up thinking, oh my gosh, talking about sex, thinking about sex was wrong. It was bad. My body was bad. My sexual desire was gross. And I don't know if you've seen, I'm sure you've seen the movie Mean Girls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the coach who's teaching sex ed, he's like, don't think about sex. If you have sex, you will get chlamydia and die.
Yeah.
And so I feel as though so much of my experience growing up in church culture was this, like shut it down, don't think about it, don't talk about it, don't think about thinking about it. And so I thought when I embarked on this journey, honestly, when I went on the journey, I had already decided I want to have sex outside of marriage moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually want to find how and where in the Bible there that I can justify that decision. And really what I found was, even from the very first pages in the God story, how God is not afraid of sex. How God is not ashamed of desire. And in Genesis 1, the beginning of the scripture, the creation account, God says, let's make humans in the God image. And in everything in God's creation, God exhaled creation into existence and said it's good. But with humans, God said humans are very good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just got so curious about that. I thought, oh, wow. So God says we're very good. Then why have I always believed that I'm a piece of crap? Why have I
Yeah.
always believed that my body is bad or my
Mm.
sexuality is bad or any of those things? And what I discovered through my research is the idea that the spirit is good and the body is bad or sexuality is bad. That's not rooted in Christian theology. That's rooted in Gnostic dualism.
Mm.
So the God story actually says we're very good. From that's chapter 1. The
Mm.
chapter 1, the beginning of the story, we're very good. So what does that mean? God didn't say, "Oh, your mind is good or your spirit is good or your right hand is good, but your left toe is bad." And oh my gosh, that's what happens when guys get turned on. Ew, disgusting. Ew, fluids, gross.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
No, actually, God designed the whole thing.
Yeah.
God designed the whole experience of what it means to be human. So that means that my sexuality, my sexual desire is a part of what it means to be human. And it's
Mm.
a very normal part.
Mm.
And so if God doesn't think it's bad, if God doesn't create bad things, then actually the starting point in the conversation is that I am made in the image of God. And because of that, I
Wow.
have I have goodness and the God image pulsing all through me.
Yeah.
So then we move through scripture and we see books like Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, where it's basically a foreplay and sex handbook. In fact, the book is so erotic that most Hebrew and Jewish children were not allowed to even read the book until they came of age. In
Wow.
fact, some Jewish doctors prescribed that their patients weren't allowed to read it until they were 30 years old. Because
Wow.
the book is all about this husband and wife having this explosive sex life.
Yeah.
The book opens with the bride giving very informed and enthusiastic consent. I want you to kiss me. I want you to go down on me. And he reciprocates. I want this. I want this. It's such a beautiful picture, a compelling picture of a shame-free sexual experience.
Mm.
And it also happens within the context of marriage.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that felt really powerful about Song of Solomon is you see multiple times through the book, their friends and family are cheering them on, not
Mm.
necessarily saying they were in the room with them, but they keep saying, go be drunk in love, eat,
Yeah.
drink, and be drunk in love,
Yeah.
which part of me is like, is that where Beyonce
Yeah.
going?
I knew you were gonna say that.
Honestly, is that
Yeah.
what is
Could
happening?
be.
It could be happening that way. So yeah, I think I see this picture throughout the pages of scripture that doesn't shame sexual desire, that doesn't shame sexuality, where sex and intimacy is not hidden from friends and family. It's
Yeah.
normalized in the pages of scripture.
Mm,
And there's also very distinct invitations throughout the scriptures that invite us to abstain from sexual activity outside of marriage. And
mm,
so, what I found in the scriptures was not a shame narrative around sex. It
mm.
wasn't, if you want to be a Christian, don't ever have sex. Ah,
Yeah.
no. Like the God story is grace alone, it's
Yeah.
Jesus alone. It's whoever you are, whatever you have or haven't done, you have a seat at the table.
Yeah. I love
And
that.
so I think going to the scripture, actually, I left that journey more conservative than when I
Mm.
started it,
Wow.
as far as physical boundaries and dating relationships. But I found that rules to produce conformity produce shame,
Mm.
but story and love can produce transformation.
Wow. I love that so much. Yeah. And so just kind of winding down here, along the theme of shame and letting go of shame and having freedom from that, the name of this podcast is Imperfect. So I always like to ask people, what is the imperfection that you're most proud of?
Oh my gosh. I think just living and breathing, existing as a human.
Yeah.
I mean, it's no fun to be around anyone who is committed to perfectionism.
Yeah. Seriously.
Those are the least fun people to be around.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Mhm.
Again, I am just so grateful and inspired by who you are and just the conversations that you have, and that you really create a space and lead with so much grace that is free from any shame. And I think that's what we need more of in this world, of
Mhm.
just like freedom and curiosity and digging deep. So again, I am just really grateful that you are here with us today. And I would love if you could just tell people how they can connect with you, where they can find Sexless in the City.
Yeah, for sure. So you can go to sexlessinthecitybook.com to check out all things book related. I just launched a really fun book trailer that's it's almost like a movie trailer of, little seedlings of what my book is about and the story. And then my website and social media handles are all The Refined Woman, and my weekly podcast comes out every Wednesday and it's called The Refined Collective. And so I'm talking all things life, love, sexuality, God, doubt, questions, all the things there on a weekly basis. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us, Kat. And thank you everyone for listening in. We'll see you next week.